Let's have a conversation this morning with two gentlemen joining us. Obafemi George is a political scientist. He's here with us in the studio. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Again.
Good morning.
Again.
Good to see you.
And we have a senior lecturer at the African Leadership School, I think, at King's College London. He joins us virtually. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me start with you, Mr. George. Is Africa first? First of all, what's your take on that France-Africa summit? They call it the Africa Forward Summit. But a good number of stuff that was said there was talking about the need, Africans telling Africans that they needed to come together. What's your assessment of all of, what's your take in all the conversation that took place there?
So, two conferences held this week, which I consider quite significant. The Nairobi conference and the Kigali conference, the Africa CEO Forum. And I think both conferences were speaking to the same issue. And you actually can't, separate both conferences. To start with, it's been said that Africa is the next frontier. And for certain obvious and strategic reasons. Number one, in terms of the population, presently we're almost 1.5 billion people in Africa. And it's been said that by 2050, Africa would have like 2.5 billion people. Africa is growing at 2.5% annually. While in Europe, population growth, in fact, in some countries in Europe, is actually declining, it's negative. Most European countries probably are growing maybe like 0.4, 0.1, 0.5%. So what that means is that Africa is the labor force of the future. Because that 1.5 billion, a good chunk are between the ages of 18 and 30. So that is strategic in terms of labor force, number one. Number two, today, Africa boasts of 65% of the arable land in the entire world. So what that also tells you that strategically, when it comes to food sufficiency, Africa is the place to watch for the future. Number three, Africa has 30% of the world's global mineral deposit. Today, Africa has the largest gold deposit. So many minerals. So whichever way you skin it, you know that Africa is the future. And that's what explains why the Russians are interested, Europe is interested, Asia is interested, and all of that. Now, let's bring it down to what happened this week. When I had that speech, Africa First, for me, it's what I would describe, it reminded me of what I read in history when the drive for self-rule started in the 40s. The great Zik of Africa, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, made popular a Spanish phrase called political risorgimento. And what that meant was that, there's a reawakening. Yeah. So what we've seen this week is a reawakening of the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And really, the last time I ever felt like this, was in the mid-70s. By the way, I was 2 years old then, but from history, from what we read in history, the last time that a leader would speak like that was when our own General Murtala Muhammad went to Addis Ababa and he gave a speech at the then OAU, now AU, and he said, Africa has come of age. That statement, resonated across Africa. And you saw many African countries rising up. That's when you have indigenization policy. Africa began to look inwards. So that political statement created an economic wave. Unfortunately, Murtala was killed. So we lost that leadership. And that trend, nosedive, it wasn't the only one killed. You have some African presidents that were taken out. Okay, that movement was stalled. What we see happening right now is that Nigeria is providing that leadership again. And we hope to see, in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that this is sustained and it is backed up by actions across the African continent. And there's no other country that is capable of providing that leadership apart from Nigeria. Let me remind you that about 20 years ago, it was said prophetically that if you look at the map of Africa, that it's like a gun, and that South Africa looks like the barrel, and that Nigeria looks like the trigger. And so therefore, for Africa to succeed, that Nigeria is actually the trigger, and that South Africa is the barrel. And today, South Africa is the largest economy, followed by Nigeria. We are the most populated country, black nation on the entire face of the earth. So when you look at those things, it tells you, where Nigeria stands as a leader in Africa. And they've said that once Nigeria gets it right, Africa will get it right.
There are so many questions in the response that you have given, but let me take Dr. Ismail's opening comments on this, because the challenge now is, first of all, Dr. Ismail, what's your take? Because while the African countries, African leaders were talking at both summits, in the course of the week, one of the questions that subsists is, do those African countries come together themselves to compare notes and say, okay, if we are going to move forward together, this is the direction we have to take? We know that not many African countries can stand on their own and say, we're not going to take anything from the West. We're not going to, they don't have a hardline anti-West or anti-West or a West resistance power stance. But there are and there are other countries, including in North Africa, who are having a kind of, and South Africa as well, who have a balanced, view of, okay, yes, Africa can do it, but we still need the support of the East, of the West, of Asia, and all of that from time to time. What's your take on this whole dynamics?
Program anchors and to also the first speaker. Yes, I completely agree that Africa is a complete continent. Africa has everything it needs for its development. But of course, Africa does not exist in isolation. Of course, you go back to centuries of slave trade, colonial conquest, and colonial rule and neo-colonial penetration of Africa since independence. You will understand that Africa, there's something about Africa that attracts external actors into the continent. Let me pivot back to the France-Africa Summit in Nairobi, as well as the Africa CEO Forum in Kigali. I think anything that brings African countries, African presidents together are quite, is quite welcome. But of course, like, you said in your opening pitch, it's not the first time that we are going to be having this African summit, Japan, Africa, US, Africa, China, Africa, France, Africa, UK, Africa, anything, everybody is summiting with Africa. So we've had this summit diplomacy for the past 10, 12 years now, or even longer than that, starting with the FOCA, with China. One thing, two key things of note here are actually three things. Number one is that there is a sense in terms of Africa having a collective, bargaining as a collective. That collectivity is the most important ingredient. Many times external actors have used divide and rule to penetrate Africa to ensure that Africa does not have a single bargaining voice, whether it comes to EPA agreement with the EU or any of these international agreements on climate change, climate justice, name it. So that lack of a collective voice, and it's always going to be very difficult to have 54 countries speaking with one voice. It's always going to be, a very difficult task. Look at the EU, 27, 28 countries, always struggling to come, to a consensus position on issues. So, anything that will help Africa to have a collective bargaining stance on major global issues is always going to be welcome. Secondly, the Africa First mantra, why it is good as an interesting slogan to take away from the summit, but more work needs to be done. What is the strategy behind this Africa First pronunciation? It is not the first time we'll be hearing nice slogans, as this, but there has to be intentionality. There has to be a deliberate strategy that is developed and worked hard on the part of Nigeria, bringing on board other key, regional powerhouses on the continent, the South Africa of this world, Algeria or Egypt of this world. Morocco is coming on very strong as well. Kenya is probably also there as well, and maybe even Rwanda, because of the way Rwanda has created itself as a regional hub for innovation on the continent. So there has to be a deliberate strategy. So what is the strategy behind this Africa First? What is the strategy? Third is that at this point in time, the world is changing. We can see all the geopolitical changes, going on in the world, the emergence of China, the resurgence of Russia, the emergence of new medium powers, projecting influence, Turkey of this world, the Iran of this world, the Brazils of this world. So all of these things are happening. And we begin to ask, where are African institutions, the AU, the ECOWAS of this world, the SADC of this world, the EACs of this world, the IGAD of this world? Where are African institutions in relation to this Africa First? What has happened to the extent that these institutions that have been created as vectors of Pan-Africanism have not been able to achieve this, collective bargaining approach to major global issues? So while Nigeria can provide, the intellectual leadership and, mobilize, this has to be connected with existing institutions on the continent on the one hand. But more importantly, the government may be talking about Africa first, but we need to also ask, what about Africans first? There is a difference between Africa first and Africans first.
And you have drawn yourself into my trap, Dr. Ismail, because I was going to actually wanted you to escape that question and attack Mr. George with it. But since you have taken it, and I'm going to take it up with you. Recently, and I mean in recent time, there's another wave of xenophobic attack in South Africa, for instance. And it would seem like the government of the day in South Africa isn't speaking much about it. Hence, the call for foreigners to leave their country continues to hold sway. And in fact, a good number of people in Nigeria are already calling on Nigerians to come back home, that the federal government should send an airpiece there to go bring Nigerians back home. That's one. We have, in recent history as well, had cases where Ghanaians are telling Nigerians, not the government of Ghana and not the government of South Africa, are telling Nigerians to go back home. So, spot on your question of how about Africans first? So perhaps that conversation should start from the people inside of each country. It's been a long time since I heard Nigerians say that a group of nationals must go back to their country. The last time I heard about it was Ghana must go, and that was in the 70s or 80s. That's quite a long time ago, some 40 years now. I don't think I've heard that in recent times. So I'm wondering if when you're asking how about Africans first, who is supposed to take the gauntlet? Is the Africans that become heads of government?
Yes, thank you. If you look at the Ghana Must Go episode in Nigeria in late 70s into the early 80s, you look at the examples you've cited in Ghana, in South Africa, maybe one or two, maybe also there have been also some anti-Nigerian issues in Kenya and perhaps Uganda. There are two or three key things that always, underline such or that precede such events. One, when countries are struggling economically, it is always easy to scapegoat foreigners. You see that happening now in America and Europe when it comes to immigration. So national governments tend to deflect blame to foreigners when it comes to the issues of poverty and lack of opportunities for people when people are not able to get by in terms of jobs and all the basic essentials of life. So it is essentially a development issue, a development problem that tends to manifest itself as these xenophobic, attacks and all of that. And of course, we also know issues of crime and all of that. There are some of our fellow Nigerians, going to other countries, being culturally insensitive by trying to install, kings and all of that in foreign land. So, but all of these things are contextualized when it comes to domestic struggles, domestic politics in those countries. But there is a bigger issue that we need to address. And I'm going to, give you a pointed example of that. You go to the border crossings, like, Lagos, semi-border crossing, and all the other border crossings between Nigeria and Cameroon, for example. Look at the amount of suffering it takes for people to cross the border. Look at the amount of extortion that happens at this border. Look at the amount of checks that happen at these borders. How easy or uneasy is it for fellow Africans to travel across the border to transact business, across the border? We hear of horror stories, even at the highest level, people like Dangote and the rest struggling to be able to, to transact business. The issue came up in terms of cross-border payment and all the other things that, that have been spoken about in the recent summit in Kigali and the rest. Even as an African, you travel from Nigeria to Benin, you have to go and buy another SIM card. Or if you put your phone on roaming, you are going to pay exorbitant, prices. So there are important institutional, inhibitions that are, that continue to militate against cross-border Africans to African,
and which is also underscoring, the challenge of the challenges you are posing about this whole Africa First thing. Well, but
definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. Because more than just a slogan, there are some low-hanging fruit that if governments in the respective African countries are genuinely interested, there are some things that they can easily get done, that they don't need any prompting.
We'll definitely get to that. I want to quickly take Mr. George up on one particular thing that he said earlier. You said that Africa has a tremendous labor force. Wouldn't we rather call it human capital as opposed to labor force? Here is why. In the next 10 years, artificial intelligence is going to be a lot more of the labor force than the human. Many people would rather, automobile industries all over the world, they use more of robotics for their labor force, if I can put it that way, than they do human beings, because for whatever reason, it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's more accurate and all of that, whatever the issues are. So in that light, you also cited that Europe, some other countries of the world, and some other continents of the world, they are losing their aged, their younger generation, and the aged ones are unavailable and unable to do some things and all of that. Consequently, they're asking Africans to come over, and that's been, mostly welcome. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, particularly in the light of this whole Africanization agenda.
On one hand, I had your question. On the other hand, you've also answered my question for me.
Okay.
Because whichever way you skin it, yes, we see the prospects and the threat of artificial intelligence to the human labor force, but you still need human beings.
But we need fewer of them.
You will still need human beings, and that's why even Europe and parts of North America like Canada are trying to engineer a kind of a deliberate migration for Africans, because once your labor force begins to shrink, no matter the level of humanoids and whatever you're creating, after a point in time, it begins to affect the productivity of your country. So you can call it labor force, you can call it human capacity development, whichever way, it is strength. Because that labor force is also your market. Because that productive labor force, which today they're in their 20s, what that means is that in the next 20, 30 years, you're going to have a lot of Africans who are getting married, who are giving birth to children, who require schools, who require clothes, food. That's a huge market. So you just don't look at it alone from the perspective of the labor force. You also see a market in there. That's why there's nothing you produce, you bring it to Nigeria, Africa, that you sell. There's a market for it. Now, for me, the question then should be, what are the challenges? Because yes, Pan-Africanism is good. Africa first, it sounds good. But how do we actually get there in real terms?
So what are the conversations that should be had? I'm sorry, Joke. What are the conversations that should be had? Here, there's Morocco. Yes. There's Algeria.
Correct.
There is Egypt.
Yes.
We are not all under one religion.
Yeah. But mind you,
just a second. You will answer all of them together.
Okay.
We are not all under one, on one religion. We're not all at the same economic level, social level, intellectual level. And every country wants to boast of its own. Africa is not one country. Unbeknownst to many young Americans and Europeans, Africa is not what country is this? Map of Africa. There is no such thing. What flag is this? This flag is the flag of... There is no such thing. Unfortunately, many of them don't know. So for those of us who know, how do we go around this thing? You may want to speak to some of the issues raised by Dr. Ismail earlier about this Africans against Africa kind of thing. We don't hear much of that in North America. In North Africa, you may want to speak to that as well. So, and in the light of all of this insecurity and all of those things, if Africa First is not just going to be a narrative or a slogan, if it's going to be a lived experience, which he's cited Murtala Muhammad speaking about, Abiola also tried to do the same thing, and here we are now talking about, President Tinubu and the president of Kenya, talking about the same thing. So where do we go from here?
Everything rises and falls on leadership. A leader must personify the movement. A leader must not just provide that agenda, but it must be seen to be driving it. And if you ask me, I think what President Tinubu did in Kigali signals that he wants to take the lead and that Nigeria is going to take the lead. 30 years ago, how many Nigerian businesses do you find in Africa? Perhaps none. But today you have the Access Bank all over Africa. You have UBA all over Africa. I mean, Nollywood has taken over the entire Africa. I just heard about 3 days ago that PalmPay is actually the biggest fintech company now in Africa. So you have Nigeria dominating the fintech space. You have Dangote setting up cement factories all over Africa. That's where it starts from. It's from that leadership. That's how you begin to break the barrier, one country at a time, one industry at a time. We have done it with Nollywood. Now, we're doing it in the financial sector. So now, we're about to do it in industry, in manufacturing. That's how you begin to break the barrier. Now, what I want to see, to be honest, in perhaps the next decade, is to see how we can integrate Africa infrastructure-wise. The founders of Pan-Africanism in the 70s, when they created this idea, they had the vision that Africa should be connected. I'll give you an example. There's what you call the Trans-Africa Highway, which was conceived in the 70s, that you should be able to drive from Dakar. There should be a highway from Dakar that would take you to Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, Togo, Nigeria, to Calabar, to Cameroon, to Gabon, down all the way to South Africa. But president after president forgot that vision. The Lagos-Calabar highway that is being constructed right now by President Tinubu is actually meant to be the portion of Nigeria in that vision. So when you have such, so if Nigeria completes Lagos-Calabar, we want to see Lagos-Ghana. We want to see Ghana, Sierra Leone. That's where it starts from. And that's why I keep saying that Nigeria seems to be providing that leadership. We also want to be able to see integration when it comes to traveling. Joke, it's easier for me. I can get to London today by 6 p.m. I can get to Paris today by 6 p.m. I might not be able to get to Uganda until Monday because it's easier for me to fly to Europe than to fly to an African country. So how then can we have commerce? How then can we have Africa first if it's difficult for me to go from Nigeria to Tanzania? And it's easier for me to go from Nigeria to Atlanta. So those are the deliberate steps we now want to begin to see. Because until you have free movement, you know, at times when I travel to Europe, I land in Paris. And I rent a car in Paris. And I drive from Paris to Brussels. Each free. I drive from Brussels to Amsterdam. In fact, I won't even know when I've crossed into Holland. It's on my TomTom that it changes that, oh, I've crossed from Belgium into Holland. You can't drive like that in Africa. And that's what we need for us to be able to actually integrate African economy. So this African free trade area, whatever that we've signed, beyond the agreement, beyond the rhetorics, we need to now begin to create deliberate steps so that Africa can trade with Africa. It will surprise you that intra-trade Africa, as at last year, as in businesses within African countries, stood at maybe from records about maybe 230 or 220 billion US dollars. In other words, that's the volume of business 54 nations did among themselves. On the contrary, with Europe alone, Africa did about 350 billion euros. With Asia alone, we did over 400 billion US dollars. By the time you put the business Africa did with Europe, with Asia, with America, it's almost $1 trillion US dollars. In other words, we are doing business with the world more than we are doing with ourselves because we lack the infrastructure that connects African countries together. Road infrastructures, I mean, air infrastructures.
Even soft infrastructure, because what Joke just said now about our colleague going to Kigali and seeing how, you know, the West, anyone with a different skin than black, gets an easier pass.
Ayo, my father-in-law went to an African country. I will not mention the country. He's a professor. He was there 4 years ago to give a speech. He was invited 3 months ago, and he was denied visa in an African country. And it was actually on the website of the African country that 4 countries have been excluded from visa application, including Nigeria.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ismail, it doesn't seem that this challenge is going to go anywhere. So perhaps the question is, how do we take this further? Thankfully, you are in one of those countries that have had a UK-Africa summit. The question will be, how far so far? So what are your thoughts? Perhaps, you know, there are certain conversations Africa should be having with itself. Let's begin to close with that.
Yeah, thanks. I think there is the ideal and there is the reality. The ideal from the 50s when the whole conversations about Pan-Africanism started and institutionalized through the OAU and later on the AU. The ideal remains to unite Africa. The United States of Africa project, people like former President Nkrumah and the rest have articulated that vision. But the reality of it now has to be based on pragmatism. We have to be sector by sector, you know, agreement and make things work. We have to build this, you know, Africa collective on a case by case, issue by issue, sector by sector basis. That I think is one. Secondly, I align with much of what Mr. George has said, but I want to throw in, you know, a bit of caution into it. Yes, the official statistics might talk about 230 billion intra-African trade, but I bet you that does not capture the informal business activities to the scale that it is, you know, it's taking place. Many of us who are researchers, academics who study these issues, we are of the view that intra-African trade is a lot more than that, you know, probably triple that. I mean, when you talk about Nigeria GDP and, you know, productivity in Nigeria, we can have a debate as to how much does it capture the informal economic activities on the continent. But be that as it may, I completely agree that all the bottlenecks that hinder intra-African trade, intra-African air linkages and travels and all of these issues around passport and all of, there have been, in the last 10 years, there have been initiatives, One Africa Passport and all of this to break all of these things, but none of these things have really worked. So what we are seeing now is bilateral arrangement. Nigeria, Rwanda talking about visa free, South Africa and Ghana and some countries, or Zimbabwe and Ghana. So if that is the way to go, let's begin to do that rather than the grandiose one.
Okay.
Then more importantly, I think it's important for us as Nigeria and, as Nigerians and for the government of Nigeria, President Tinubu has articulated this Africa First, Nigeria First vision, which is fine. There has to be the serious hard work of developing a strategy of what would this mean in real life? What would this mean in practical sense? Who are the key stakeholders that Nigeria need to bring on board? How can Nigeria connect this vision with the African Union, with ECOWAS and the rest? And my final point is this, and it might sound funny, but I think it's also time Nigeria convened a Nigeria-Africa summit, whereby Nigeria is gathering all the other African countries in the same way that Turkey, the same way that France, in the same way that the US, UK.
I don't think it is funny. I think it's a highly.
Nigeria has to assert itself.
Absolutely.
That look, we have the labor force. Nigeria, the soft power through not just Nollywood but also Afrobeat. We have our banks are all over the place. Dangote, Boa, and all our entrepreneurs, industrialists are now spreading their tentacles. Nigeria is genuinely going to.
We are hugely.
Nigeria has to convene a Nigerian African summit to have a dialogue to say this is Nigeria's vision, this is where we are headed.
I'm wondering if I wonder if Mr.
So
George.
that has to be part of the conversation for us as Nigerians and for the Nigerian government to show that.
Well, the president has begun to do that talk, but I wonder if you agree with that, the Nigeria-Africa summit.
I agree partly, but we need to tread with caution.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. I love the leadership position, the leadership posture of President Tinubu with the speeches that he gave in Kigali and in Nairobi. However, I would want to see him drive that agenda not as a Nigerian agenda, but as an African Union agenda. I would want to see him hide behind the toga of African Union to drive the agenda. Well, you know why? You know why? Naturally, if you've been to so many African countries, especially the Francophone, they feel threatened by the mere presence of a Nigerian. Well, there's a rivalry, there is envy.
I apologize, Mr. George. Let them maintain that envy. Maybe it will drive us to do what we need to do. You know why we need to tread cautiously? Because you need cooperation. You don't want confrontation. Yeah. Absolutely.
And the way you can get them to cooperate with us,
they will take our cooperation. You know why?
The
when they needed us for ECOWAS, we were there. When they needed us for their security, we were there. We are humble.
We need to
go. We will be humble.
Let's be humble. Let's not put it in their faces.
Thank you so much.
I disagree, though.
We'll have part 2 of this debate. Part 2 is going to come. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Dr. Olawale Ismail is a senior lecturer at the King's College London, as well as Obafemi George, who is a political scientist. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning.
My pleasure. My pleasure.